So throughout this month of September, we've been thinking about what it means to be called by God and to live into God's purpose for our lives. And we often think that our calling involves our work or our employment, our vocation. That's not always the case, though. This morning, we're looking at the story of Ruth, and Ruth's story invites us to ask, what does it look like when God's call has to do with our everyday relationships in life? So the story of Ruth begins with a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, and they lived with their two sons in the town of Bethlehem. Now there was a famine in Bethlehem at the time, and so in order to escape the famine, Elimelech decides to take his family to an area of the world called Moab. And the people of Moab were bitter enemies of the people of Israel. But Elimelech was desperate, so he took his family to that hated land of Moab, just in case there was a chance that they could have a better life. Well, after settling into their new life in Moab, Elimelech shortly dies, leaving Naomi and her two sons. Before long, Naomi's sons end up marrying Moabite women named Orpah and Ruth. 10 years later, the sons die, and this leaves Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth as widows. And at the time, widows would have faced great difficulty without husbands or sons to support them. And remember that Naomi was also an outsider. She was an immigrant Israelite in the enemy land of Moab. Without a husband or son to care for her, she was extremely alone. Well, Naomi got news that the famine back home in Bethlehem had ended, so she decided to journey back to Bethlehem. Her two widowed daughters-in-law started that journey with her, but Naomi urged her daughters-in-law, no, don't come with me, return to your own families of origin so that the Lord might provide you with new husbands and therefore better futures. But both Orpah and Ruth initially refused to follow Naomi's advice. They said they weren't going to stay here in Moab. They were going to go with Naomi to be with her people. And this is fascinating. Remember, Ruth and Orpah are Moabites, not Israelites. They would have no real reason to stay with Naomi and go back to Naomi's homeland, but they decide to stay with her. They say they want to. But Naomi pushes back on them a second time, saying, why? Why would you come with me? It's still a bleak picture. And I'm too old to have another husband, let alone any more sons who could be your husbands. So even if I had a husband and gave birth to sons, would you really stay unmarried until these new sons grew up? No, your future is so much brighter for you here in your homeland. And this is where this morning's scripture passage comes in. After this second urging by Naomi, Orpah decides to stay in Moab. Ruth does not. Ruth clings to Naomi and says, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people, the Israelites, will become my people, and your God will become my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Ruth was willing to give up everything she knew, her homeland, her people, her culture, in order to stay with Naomi. Ruth was willing to stay with Naomi even when she knew that she would probably not be very well received by those people back in Bethlehem. For then Ruth would be the one who is the outsider. She was a Moabite with whom the good religious people of Bethlehem would not want to associate. For a Moabite, and one who had been part of a mixed marriage with a Hebrew man, for a Moabite woman to set foot in Bethlehem would have been to set off all of the cultural and social and religious detectors of the time. In her choice to stay with Naomi and to leave her homeland of Moab, Ruth knew that she would face not only a language barrier, but also a food barrier, a social etiquette barrier, a religious practice barrier. She would also face the subtle and maybe not so subtle reminders that she was not one of us. But that's what Ruth signed up for. That's what Ruth was prepared to face. While there are no explicit references to God in this text or in the entire book of Ruth, Ruth clearly feels compelled. She feels called to stay with Naomi. And as we continue through the scriptures, through the rest of the Bible, we learn just how important Ruth's decision was. Without her willingness to move to Israel, she would not have developed a relationship with the God of the Israelites, and she would not have found her future husband, Boaz, with whom she would give birth to a son named Obed, who would then have a son named Jesse, who would then have a son named David. And David, Ruth's great-grandson, would become one of the greatest kings in Israel's history. Ruth makes an improbable companion to Naomi and an unlikely character to have a book of the Bible named after her. In fact, it was probably a bit shocking to the Israelites to have such a focus on Ruth. She had so many things going against her. She was a foreigner, she was a woman, she was a widow, and perhaps of most importance, she was a Moabite, an enemy of Israel. And the book of Ruth repeatedly reminds its readers of Ruth's enemy status by referring to her throughout the book as Ruth the Moabite. But one of the things that the story of Ruth declares is God's radical inclusivity. The story of Ruth and the mere fact that there is a book of the Bible named Ruth stands as a critique to some of the things that were going on during this time in Israel's history. Because during this time, both Ezra and Nehemiah, the leaders of Israel, they had both tried to purify Israel and cement its ethnic identity by casting out foreign wives and their children from the land. Ruth was one of those foreign wives who would have been cast out with her children by their efforts. But instead, in a marvelous reversal of expectation, God uses Ruth and her descendants to save the nation of Israel. Ruth, a foreigner, an immigrant, a woman from the hated Moabites, is the beloved great-grandmother of King David himself. It's a reminder that God can and God does use everyone to build God's kingdom, not just the people who we think are particularly worthy. But as I said before, in the book of Ruth, God is not mentioned. God is not a main character in this book. The actions in the book of Ruth take place among humans in their everyday life, but God's role is implicit in the interactions and plot reversals of the story. Ruth reverses the trajectory of Naomi's life. Ruth moves Naomi from despair and barrenness to despair and death to fertility and hope. What starts in barrenness and death ends with fruitfulness and new birth. Ruth becomes the ancestress of King David, and the king descends, that means the king descends from an immigrant, an enemy, a widow woman who chooses to befriend another woman, another widow. Her story, Ruth's story, tells of ordinary and harsh human life in which the providence and the calling of God is clear. The story of Ruth reminds us that God often seems hidden. but God is always active in human life. The story of Ruth tells us of a redemptive God who brings about reversals, who turns barrenness to fertility, and from death turns death to rebirth. It tells the story of an inclusive God who acts through the enemy, through the one who is least likely to matter in the community. And as we go on in the scriptures and we get to Matthew's gospel, we read in Jesus' genealogy, and Ruth is right there in the middle of it. Ruth is right in the middle of Jesus' family tree. And this reminds us that Jesus himself was the offspring of mixed race. Jesus' own genealogy, therefore, is a reminder of God's inclusive nature and willingness to work through unexpected people. Ruth's story also demonstrates to us how God's call can be about our relationships, not just our work or our employment. Ruth's faithfulness and her everyday love leads to a deeper relationship with Naomi, which then leads to a deeper relationship with God. Throughout the rest of the book of Ruth, both Naomi and Ruth experience the inbreaking of God through their faithful relationship. A key theme in the story of Ruth is that faithful relationships and everyday love between people can be a calling, and it can be a demonstration of God's love. Sometimes God's call upon our lives is the call to be family and to care for someone in particular, like Ruth cared for Naomi. And there are a wide variety of ways that God might call us to be family. For some, the call to be family is experienced in God's call to be a parent and raise children. Some people are called to be stay-at-home parents, putting aside their careers for at least a period of time in order to care for their children. For some, though, the call to be family is experienced as God's call to be a caregiver, or a caregiver to a spouse, or maybe a parent or a child or a relative or a friend. For some, the call to be family results in what we now call families of choice, those special relationships between people who are not related by blood or by marriage, but who consider themselves family nonetheless. The list of the variety of ways that God calls us to be family and calls us in our relationships with others goes on and on. God's call is not exclusively about what we do for our employment. God calls us in a variety of ways. And the call to be family, the call within our relationships, is a call that we, each of us, experience at one time or another throughout life. So throughout this sermon series, I want to look at some stories of other people who have answered God's call. And there's a story relating to the call to be family that I want to share this morning that comes from our Wesleyan heritage. Susanna Wesley was the mother of John Wesley, and John Wesley is the founder of the Methodist Church. Susanna Wesley was born on January 20th, 1669. She experienced many different hardships throughout her life. Her husband, Samuel Wesley, spent time in debtor's prison twice because of his poor financial abilities. And the lack of money was a continual struggle for Susanna and her family. Her house was burned down not once, but twice. And during one of those fires, her son, John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, nearly died and had to be rescued from a second-story window. At one point in her life, Susanna's husband left her and the children for over a year because of an argument that they had between husband and wife. Disagreement around politics, if you believe that. Susanna Wesley took the call to be a parent seriously. She was the youngest of, get this, 25 children. So it seemed unexceptional to her that she gave birth to 19 children, including 2 sets of twins. And of those 19 children, 10 survived to adulthood. There were 3 sons and 7 daughters. Susanna was a strict disciplinarian, saying that in order to form the minds of children, the very first thing to be done is to conquer their will and bring them to an obedient temper. She did not spare the rod, and most likely would have been thrown in jail if she lived in today's society for child abuse. In the year 1709, one of those fires that came to their house destroyed her home in Epworth, in 15 minutes on one cold February night. Homeless, the family was forced to split apart. So for a while, 2 of her daughters were looked after by an uncle in London, while the other children stayed with friends nearer to home. Susanna's 19th child was born 1 month later, and not for the first time in her life was Susanna deeply sad and almost immobilized by shock and grief. Nevertheless, she persisted, and with a relentless determination, she united her family and her determination to save her children's souls. This, she wrote, was indeed her focus for 20 years of the prime of her life. So although Susanna never preached a sermon or published a book or founded a church, Susanna Wesley is known as the mother of Methodism. Why? Because 2 of her sons, John Wesley and his brother Charles Wesley, founded our church. When John and Charles were children, though, the home life that Susanna provided them gave them the foundation for their experience and their practice of the faith. And I found a video online that helps us to get to know Susanna a little bit better, and it's shot actually on location at the Wesley's home in Epworth. So let's take a look.
Susanna has been called all sorts of things in the course of Methodist history, if you like, the immortal mother, the mother of the Wesleys, the mother of Methodism. She was undoubtedly a remarkable woman. I mean, thankfully, the family did write copious letters one to another, and that gives us so much rich evidence about how they related, what they thought of each other. Now, Susanna took it upon herself, really, to educate the children, to bring them up in their faith. I mean, obviously, Samuel had an important role in all of that, but Susanna never shirked from her responsibilities, and she saw almost her reason for being on this earth was to bring these children up as well as she possibly could. She developed a sort of what we now call like a home school, really, around her kitchen table. And all the children, from the time they could speak, were put to their lessons in the kitchen. Even the girls. Now, at that time, in the early 18th century, girls didn't really have an education like that. They were taught to sew and to be good wives and mothers. From the minute they could speak, they were taught their alphabet and expected to learn it within a day. She thought they were, 2 of them spent a day and a half, and she thought they were terribly slow and backward to be doing that. So she had quite high standards, and she would sit them all down around the table and teach them their letters, but also teach them their faith, teach them rudimentary geography and history. I mean, it was quite a wide sort of curriculum that she developed. They were required to say certain prayers, to recite the Lord's Prayer as soon as they were able to pray for their parents, to pray for their siblings, to pray for the household. And then when they were a bit older, they would read scripture before they came downstairs, even for breakfast. And the older ones would help the younger ones. And there was a real sort of method, really. That word method and discipline is vital to this whole story. She would also take an hour every day for her own personal devotions, and the family knew they were not to disturb her. So she taught them the importance, by example, if you like, of their own devotional life, of praying and of reading scripture, and of actually trying to think through their theology. She also wrote quite a lot of sort of theological ideas down in letter form, particularly for John and Charles, and for others of the family as well. I mean, she was quite a woman, really well ahead of her time. We could argue that Methodism began here in this house, because I think the influence of that methodical upbringing did actually, influence John quite significantly in his life.
Susanna Wesley was a remarkable Christian woman, and we can only wonder what she might have done if she were alive in this 21st century. But she was not of the 21st century. She was of the 17th and 18th centuries, and it is in that context, tucked away in this little town in northern England, where she planted seeds in her children's minds that began the Methodist movement. Her frequent illnesses and no doubt the often poor health of others in the family as they suffered the wants of poverty planted a seed for her children to later have a deep concern for health clinics for the poor. Her effective homeschooling planted a seed for her children to understand the importance of education, and it led the Wesleys to support schools for the indigent and trade schools where the unskilled could learn ways to lift themselves out of poverty and dependence. Susanna's strong, independent thought, she was a strong, independent woman, that strength of character within her planted the seed for her children to begin to respect differences in persons and beliefs. The seeds of her determination to provide regularity in a world of disorder planted the seed of the method for bringing creative, positive, Christ-centered change. And from the seeds of Susanna Wesley's example and methods, Methodism grew. That's the kind of thing that can happen when we answer God's call to be family. As in the stories of Ruth and Susanna Wesley, God's call can be lived out in our everyday love for others. Ruth and Susanna's calling was lived out in loyalty and daily faithfulness. God uses the simple things to bring about extraordinary outcomes. The story of Ruth shows us that God's call is not always dramatic. God's call can look like simply being loyal and faithful and the daily decision we might make to love. Susanna Wesley's life demonstrates to us that similar truth. Susanna never preached to the crowds, but she poured herself out into her family, and her quiet faith shaped generations. So here's the question I believe God is placing before us this morning. Where is God calling you in your relationships? Who in your life needs your presence or your loyalty or your care? Maybe it's a child or a spouse, a parent, a friend, a neighbor, maybe even someone that you would least expect. This week, I would invite you to take one step forward and to live into that call. So send that note, make that visit, offer forgiveness, show up. Do that small thing that demonstrates the big love of God. Like Ruth, you may not see the full picture of what God is doing. Like Susanna, you may not know the impact that your daily faithfulness will have 300 years later. But God is at work through ordinary love, building extraordinary outcomes. So go. Answer God's call in your relationships and trust that through your faithfulness, God is writing a bigger story than you could ever imagine.